The bruise on Clara Ashford's cheek had faded to a sickly yellow by the time she stepped off the stagecoach in Williamsburg, Virginia, but the words her stepfather had hurled at her still echoed fresh and raw. "No man will ever want you, girl. You're too wild, too stubborn, too much of everything wrong. You'll die alone and unloved, mark my words." It was 1878, and Clara had 22 years of being told she was unworthy, unlovable, and unwanted. The leather satchel in her hand contained everything she owned in this world, which amounted to 3 dresses, a worn Bible her mother had given her before dying, and $17 she had stolen from the man who had made her childhood a living nightmare. She did not feel guilty about the theft. She felt free. Williamsburg was smaller than she had imagined, a collection of weathered buildings clustered along a dusty main street that seemed to shimmer in the August heat. The air smelled of horses, tobacco, and the faint salt breeze that drifted inland from the Chesapeake Bay. Clara had chosen this town because it was far enough from Richmond that her stepfather would not think to look for her here, and because the newspaper advertisement she had seen promised work for women willing to labor in the tobacco fields. It was not glamorous work, but Clara had never been afraid of hard labor. What she feared was being trapped, being owned, being told one more time that she was worthless. She found lodging at a boarding house run by a widow named Mrs. Hutchins, a round-faced woman with kind eyes who asked no questions about the bruise or the fact that Clara traveled alone. The room was small but clean, with a narrow bed and a window that overlooked the stable yard. That first night, Clara lay awake listening to the unfamiliar sounds of this new place, the distant laughter from the saloon, the whinny of horses, the creak of wagon wheels. She pressed her hand against her chest and felt her heart beating strong and steady. She was alive. She was free. That would have to be enough. The tobacco fields stretched for acres beyond the edge of town, and the work was exactly as brutal as Clara had expected. She woke before dawn and worked until her hands bled, pulling leaves under the merciless Virginia sun. The other women who worked alongside her were mostly older, their faces lined with years of hardship, and they regarded Clara with suspicion at first. But she proved herself quickly, never complaining, never slowing, never asking for special treatment. By the end of the first week, they had accepted her as one of their own. It was on a Saturday afternoon, 2 weeks after her arrival, that Clara first saw Lucas Fairmont. She had gone into the general store to buy thread and a bar of soap, counting out her coins carefully because every cent mattered. She was examining a display of fabric when she heard a commotion outside, the sound of hooves and shouting. Through the store window, she saw a massive chestnut stallion rearing up in the middle of the street, eyes rolling white with terror. The man trying to control the horse was tall and lean, with dark hair that fell past his collar and a face that seemed carved from sun-bronzed stone. He was not fighting the horse but talking to it, his voice low and steady, his movements careful and deliberate. Clara found herself moving toward the door, drawn by something she could not name. She watched as the man slowly reached up and placed his hand on the horse's neck, still talking in that calm, unhurried way. The stallion's ears flickered forward, then back, then forward again. Gradually, the animal's panic subsided. Its hooves touched the ground. It stood there trembling, but no longer fighting. The man stroked its neck and pressed his forehead against the horse's nose, and Clara felt something twist in her chest at the gentleness of the gesture. "That's Lucas Fairmont," said a voice beside her. Clara turned to see Mrs. Hutchins, who had also stopped to watch the scene. Best horse trainer in all of Virginia, maybe in all the South. Has a way with animals that some folks call magic, though it's just patience and understanding if you ask me. He's a good man, that one. Keeps to himself mostly, but good." Clara wanted to ask more, but Mrs. Hutchins had already moved on, and Clara forced herself to return to the store and complete her purchase. Yet as she walked back to the boarding house, she found herself thinking about the man and the horse, about the gentleness in his hands and the patience in his voice. She told herself it meant nothing. Men were dangerous. Men took and broke and destroyed. She had learned that lesson too well to forget it now. But Williamsburg was a small town, and Clara saw Lucas Fairmont again 3 days later at the town well. She had come to draw water before heading to the fields, and he was there watering his horses. Up close, she could see that his eyes were an unusual shade of gray-green, like the sea before a storm. He touched the brim of his hat when he saw her, a gesture of politeness that seemed ingrained rather than calculated. "Morning, miss," he said, and his voice was the same low, steady tone she had heard him use with the frightened stallion. "Good morning," Clara replied, and she hated the way her voice came out thin and uncertain. She was not a timid woman. She had survived things that would have broken weaker souls. But something about this man made her feel exposed, as though he could see all the broken pieces she had worked so hard to hide. She drew her water quickly and turned to leave, but her foot caught on a loose stone and she stumbled. The bucket tipped, water sloshing over the rim, and she would have fallen if Lucas had not caught her arm. His grip was firm but not tight, steadying without restraining, and he released her the moment she had her balance. "You all right?" he asked, and there was genuine concern in his eyes. "I'm fine," Clara said, stepping back, putting distance between them. "Thank you." She hurried away before he could say anything else, her heart hammering against her ribs. That night, lying in her narrow bed, she pressed her fingers against the spot on her arm where he had touched her and wondered why it had not felt like a violation. Why it had felt, instead, like safety. The summer wore on, hot and humid, and Clara fell into the rhythm of her new life. She worked in the fields, saved every penny she could, and slowly began to believe that she might actually build something here. A life of her own. A future that belonged only to her. She saw Lucas Fairmont from time to time, always at a distance, and each time she felt that same strange pull, that same unsettling mixture of fear and fascination. She told herself to ignore it. She told herself that wanting anything from a man was a path to ruin. Then came the day in late September when Clara's past caught up with her. She was walking back from the fields, tired and dusty, when she saw the man standing outside the boarding house. He was thick-bodied and red-faced, with small, mean eyes that had haunted her nightmares for years. Her stepfather. He had found her. Clara's first instinct was to run, but her legs felt like lead. She stood frozen in the middle of the street as he turned and saw her. The smile that spread across his face was not warm. It was victorious. "There you are, girl," he said, his voice carrying down the street. "Been looking for you. You got something that belongs to me and I've come to collect." People were stopping to watch. Clara felt their eyes on her, felt the weight of their judgment. A runaway daughter. A thief. All the whispers she had feared were about to come true. "I don't have anything of yours," Clara said, and she was proud that her voice did not shake. "And I'm not going back." Her stepfather's face darkened. He took a step toward her, and Clara saw his hand curl into a fist. She had seen that fist before. She knew exactly what it could do. "You're going to give me my money, and then you're going to get on that stagecoach, or I'm going to make you wish you had," he said, his voice low and dangerous. Clara lifted her chin. She would not cower, not anymore. "No." He moved fast for a man his size, crossing the distance between them in 3 strides. Clara braced herself for the blow, but it never came. Instead, Lucas Fairmont stepped between them, appearing as though from nowhere, his hand catching her stepfather's wrist in mid-swing. "I don't believe the lady wants to go with you," Lucas said, and his voice was still that same calm, steady tone, but there was steel beneath it now. Her stepfather tried to jerk his arm free, but Lucas's grip did not budge. "This is none of your business, boy. This is my daughter, and she's a thief." "She's not your daughter," Lucas said quietly. "A father doesn't raise his fist to his child, and even if she was, she's told you no. That's the end of it." Clara watched in amazement as Lucas forced her stepfather's arm down. Not violently, but inexorably, the same way he had calmed the frightened stallion. Just patience and strength, applied in equal measure. Her stepfather's face turned purple with rage, but he was outmatched and he knew it. "This is not over," he spat, but he was already backing away, already defeated. He turned and strode toward the saloon, and Clara felt her knees start to buckle with relief. Lucas caught her elbow, steadying her again. "You need to sit down," he said gently. He guided her to the bench outside the boarding house, and Mrs. Hutchins came rushing out with a cup of water. Clara drank it gratefully, her hands shaking so badly she nearly spilled it. Lucas crouched down in front of her, his eyes level with hers. "Is he really your stepfather?" he asked quietly. Clara nodded, not trusting herself to speak. "Did you steal from him?" She nodded again, then found her voice. "I took the money he owed my mother, money from her inheritance that he spent on whiskey and gambling. I only took what was rightfully mine." Lucas studied her face for a long moment, and Clara had the strange sensation that he was seeing not just her bruises, old and new, but all the scars that did not show on the surface. All the ways she had been broken, and all the ways she had put herself back together. "He won't bother you again," Lucas said finally. "I'll make sure of it." "Why?" The word escaped before Clara could stop it. "Why would you help me? You don't even know me." Something shifted in Lucas's expression, something that looked almost like pain. "Because I know what it's like to be told you're not worth loving," he said quietly. "And I know what it's like to believe it." Before Clara could respond, he stood and touched his hat brim again, that same gesture of unconscious courtesy. "If you need anything, my ranch is 2 miles west of town. The Fairmont place. Anyone can tell you how to find it." Then he was gone, walking away with long, easy strides, and Clara was left sitting on the bench with her heart doing strange, complicated things in her chest. That night, Mrs. Hutchins told Clara the story. Lucas Fairmont's father had been a drunk and a bully, a man who had beaten his wife and son with equal enthusiasm. Lucas's mother had died when he was 15, and Lucas had run away shortly after, living rough for years, working ranches and learning everything he could about horses. He had come back to Williamsburg 5 years ago, bought the old Henderson ranch with money he had saved, and built it into one of the most successful horse operations in Virginia. He was 30 years old, well respected, and completely alone. "Folks have tried to match him up with their daughters," Mrs. Hutchins said, pouring Clara another cup of tea, "but he's never shown interest. I think he's afraid of turning into his father, afraid of what he might become if he lets himself get too close to anyone." Clara understood that fear. She understood it in her bones. The next morning she woke to find her stepfather gone. The stagecoach driver said he had left on the dawn coach, muttering curses but leaving nonetheless. Clara should have felt relieved, but instead she felt unsettled. Lucas had done what he promised. He had protected her, and she had no idea how to repay that kind of debt. She thought about it for 3 days, and then she made a decision. She bought a loaf of bread from the baker, wrapped it carefully in cloth, and walked the 2 miles west to the Fairmont ranch. The property was beautiful in a rough, practical way. Well-maintained fences, a sturdy barn, corrals where horses moved with easy grace. Clara stood at the gate for a long moment, gathering her courage, before she walked up the dirt drive to the main house. Lucas opened the door before she could knock. He was in his shirt sleeves, his hair damp as though he had just washed, and he looked surprised to see her. "Miss Ashford," he said. "I brought you bread," Clara said, and immediately felt foolish. What kind of thank you was bread? To thank you for what you did. Lucas looked at the wrapped loaf, then at her face, and something warm flickered in his eyes. "You didn't have to do that, I know, but I wanted to." Clara held out the bread and Lucas took it, his fingers briefly brushing hers. "Would you like to come in?" he asked. "I just made coffee." Clara knew she should say no. She should maintain distance, protect herself, keep the walls firmly in place. But she found herself nodding, and then she was following Lucas into his home. The inside of the house was neat and sparse, furnished with handmade furniture that showed skill and care. Lucas poured coffee into 2 tin cups, and they sat at his kitchen table, and for a few minutes neither of them spoke. It was not an uncomfortable silence. It felt, instead, like they were both figuring out how to navigate this strange new territory. "I wanted you to know," Clara said finally, "that what you did meant more to me than I can properly express. No one has ever stood up for me like that before." Lucas turned his cup in his hand, studying it. "Your stepfather was wrong," he said quietly. "What he said about you, about no one wanting you, he was wrong." Clara felt her throat tighten. "How do you know what he said?" I asked around, wanted to make sure I understood the situation. Lucas looked up, and the intensity in his eyes made Clara's breath catch. "He's wrong, Clara. You're brave and strong, and any man would be lucky to have you in his life." Hearing her name in his voice felt intimate, too intimate. Clara set down her cup with a trembling hand. "You don't know me. You don't know what I've done, what I've been through. You don't know how damaged I am." "Then let me learn," Lucas said simply. "Let me know you." The offer hung in the air between them, terrifying and tempting in equal measure. Clara stood abruptly, her chair scraping against the floor. "I should go." Lucas stood too, but he did not try to stop her. "Will you come back?" he asked. Clara looked at him, this man who had gentle hands and patient eyes, this man who understood loneliness because he lived it every day. "I don't know," she whispered. But 3 days later, she found herself walking back down that dirt drive, this time with nothing in her hands but her own fragile hope. Lucas was in the corral working with a young mare, and when he saw Clara, his whole face lit up in a way that made her chest ache. That was how it began. Clara started visiting the ranch once a week, then twice, then every few days. Lucas taught her about horses, showing her how to read their body language, how to earn their trust. He never pushed, never demanded, never made her feel like she owed him anything. He just existed in her space with a steadiness that gradually wore down her defenses. They talked while they worked, sharing stories of their pasts in small, careful pieces. Lucas told her about the day he had finally stood up to his father, about the beating that had followed, about running away with nothing but the clothes on his back. Clara told him about her mother's death, about the years of being told she was worthless, about the night she had finally gathered the courage to leave. "I was so afraid," she admitted one afternoon. They were sitting on the fence watching the horses graze, the October sun warm on their faces. "I thought if I left I would just prove him right, that I would fail, that I would end up with nothing." "But you didn't fail," Lucas said. "You built a new life. That takes courage most people don't have." Clara looked at him, this man who had also rebuilt himself from ruins. "You did the same thing." Lucas smiled, a real smile that reached his eyes. "I guess we're both stubborn that way." The first time Lucas touched her hand, it was an accident. They were mending a fence and their fingers brushed as they both reached for the hammer. But instead of pulling away, Clara let her hand rest against his. Lucas went very still, looking down at their joined hands as though he could not quite believe it was real. "Is this all right?" he asked quietly. Clara nodded, not trusting her voice. Lucas turned his hand and laced his fingers through hers, and they stood there in the afternoon sunlight, holding hands like children, and Clara felt something inside her chest crack open. The town had started to notice their growing attachment. Mrs. Hutchins smiled knowingly whenever Clara returned from the ranch. The other women in the tobacco fields teased her gently. Clara waited for the judgment, for the whispers that she was being too forward, too fast, too something. But instead, people seemed pleased. Lucas was well liked, and the town apparently thought Clara was good for him. It was late November, the air turning crisp with the promise of winter, when Lucas finally said the words that had been building between them for months. They were in his barn, brushing down the horses after a long day, and Clara was humming softly to herself without realizing it. Lucas stopped what he was doing and just watched her, and when Clara noticed, she felt her cheeks flush. "What?" she asked. "I'm in love with you," Lucas said simply. "I know I probably shouldn't say it. I know you might not be ready to hear it. But I'm tired of holding it in, and you deserve to know the truth." Clara felt like all the air had been sucked from the barn, her hand stilled on the horse's flank. "Lucas, you don't have to say anything back," Lucas continued, his voice gentle but firm. "I'm not saying it to pressure you or to get something from you. I'm saying it because it's true, and because I think you should know that you are very much loved for exactly who you are. Not who anyone thinks you should be, just you, Clara, wild and stubborn and brave and beautiful." Tears were running down Clara's face before she even realized she was crying. All her life, she had been told she was too much, too loud, too opinionated, too difficult. And here was this man telling her that she was loved not despite those things, but because of them. "I'm scared," she whispered. "I'm scared of needing you. I'm scared of what happens if this goes wrong." Lucas crossed the barn and stood in front of her, close enough that she could feel the warmth radiating from his body. "I'm scared too," he admitted. "I'm terrified of becoming my father, of hurting you the way he hurt my mother, but I think being scared is better than being alone. And I think maybe we can be scared together." Clara looked up at him, at this man who had shown her more kindness in a few months than she had received in her entire life. "Then watch me love you forever," she said, the words tumbling out in a rush. "Because I do love you, Lucas. I think I've loved you since the day you stood between me and my stepfather. Since the day you showed me that not all men take and break, that some men protect and heal." Lucas made a sound that was half laugh, half sob, and then his hands were cupping her face and he was kissing her. It was Clara's first real kiss, and it was everything she had never dared to hope for. Gentle and passionate, tender and fierce, full of all the words they had not yet said, and all the promises they were still learning how to make. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Lucas pressed his forehead to hers. "Marry me," he said. "I know it's fast, I know we should wait, but I don't want to wait. I want to start our life together. I want to wake up next to you every morning and fall asleep with you every night." "Say yes, Clara." Clara should have been sensible. She should have pointed out that they had only known each other for 3 months. She should have worried about what people would say. But she had spent her whole life being sensible and careful and afraid, and it had brought her nothing but misery. So instead, she kissed him again and whispered against his lips, "Yes." They were married 3 weeks later in a simple ceremony at the church, with Mrs. Hutchins crying happy tears and half the town in attendance. Clara wore a new dress that she had sewn herself, pale blue with lace at the collar, and Lucas wore his best suit and looked at her like she was the sun itself. When the preacher pronounced them man and wife and Lucas kissed her, Clara felt something she had never felt before. She felt like she was home, The early days of their marriage were a revelation. Lucas was patient with Clara's fears, never pushing when she pulled away, always giving her space to adjust to this new reality of sharing a life with someone. And gradually, Clara learned to trust not just Lucas but herself. She learned that she could be vulnerable without being weak, that she could need someone without losing herself. They fell into an easy partnership. Clara proved to have a natural gift with the horses, particularly the difficult ones that needed extra patience and care. Lucas taught her everything he knew, and together they built the ranch into something even more successful. Clara also discovered that she loved the business side of things, the negotiations and accounts that Lucas found tedious. They complemented each other perfectly, each bringing strengths that balanced the other's weaknesses. Winter passed into spring, and with the warm weather came new challenges. A neighboring rancher named Hoskins started causing trouble, angry that Lucas had outbid him for a prime piece of land. Hoskins spread rumors that Lucas had cheated him, that Clara was a bad influence, that the Fairmont ranch was succeeding through dishonest means. It was all lies, transparent and petty, but it still stung. Clara was in town one day buying supplies when she overheard two women talking about her. "Did you hear she was a runaway, stole from her own father? Makes you wonder what else she's capable of." Clara's first instinct was to hide, to pretend she had not heard. But then she thought about everything Lucas had taught her about standing tall, about knowing her own worth. She turned to face the women, both of whom had the grace to look embarrassed at being caught. "Yes, I left my stepfather's house," Clara said clearly. "I left because he was a cruel man who hurt me, and I took the money that belonged to my late mother. If that makes me a thief in your eyes, so be it. But I won't apologize for saving myself, and I won't hide from gossip spread by small-minded people." She walked away with her head high, her heart pounding, and by the time she reached the ranch, Lucas was already there waiting. Someone had told him what happened, and the pride in his eyes when he looked at her made Clara's breath catch. "That's my girl," he said, pulling her into his arms. "That's my brave, strong, magnificent wife." Clara buried her face in his chest and let herself feel the full force of his love, let it wash away the sting of the gossip and the old wounds that sometimes still ached. She was loved. She was valued. She was home. The trouble with Hoskins came to a head in late summer. Clara was alone at the ranch one afternoon, Lucas having gone to a neighboring town to look at some horses, when Hoskins showed up drunk and belligerent. He demanded that Clara tell Lucas to sell him the disputed land at half its value, threatening to burn down their barn if they refused. Clara felt fear ice through her veins, but she also felt anger. She had not survived her stepfather's cruelty to be cowed by another bully. She stepped out onto the porch with Lucas's rifle in her hands, not pointing it at Hoskins, but making sure he could see it. "You need to leave," she said, her voice steady. "Right now." Hoskins laughed, but it was an uneasy sound. "You going to shoot me, little girl, if you threaten my home and my husband?" "Yes," Clara said simply. "I've built a life here and I won't let you destroy it. So you can ride out now, or we can wait for the sheriff to arrive. One of your ranch hands already went to fetch him." It was a bluff, but Hoskins did not know that. He looked at Clara, at the rifle, at the determination in her face, and apparently decided it was not worth the risk. He spat in the dirt and rode away cursing, and Clara stood on the porch until he was out of sight before her legs started shaking. When Lucas came home that evening and heard what happened, he held Clara so tightly she could barely breathe. "You could have been hurt," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "But I wasn't," Clara replied. "I protected what's ours, just like you protected me." Lucas pulled back to look at her, and there were tears in his eyes. "You're the strongest person I've ever known," he said. "The bravest." I'm in awe of you every single day." Clara kissed him then, pouring all her love and gratitude into the gesture. They made love that night with a desperate tenderness, holding each other close, reaffirming everything they meant to each other. And afterward, lying tangled together in the darkness, Clara whispered the words she had been holding inside for weeks. "I think I'm pregnant." She felt Lucas go still, then his hand moved to rest on her stomach, gentle and reverent. "Are you sure?" "Pretty sure. I've missed 2 cycles now, and I've been sick in the mornings." Clara turned to look at him, trying to read his expression in the moonlight. "Are you happy about it?" "Happy," Lucas's voice cracked. "Clara, I'm terrified and thrilled and so grateful I can barely breathe. We're going to have a baby. We're going to be parents." They held each other and talked into the early hours of the morning about their hopes and fears, about what kind of parents they wanted to be, about breaking the cycles of pain that had defined their own childhoods. Lucas promised he would never raise his hand to their child, never make them feel unloved or unwanted. Clara promised she would give their child the freedom to be exactly who they were meant to be. Together, they promised to build something better than what they had been given. The pregnancy was not easy. Clara was sick frequently in the early months, and as she grew larger, the Virginia heat became oppressive. But Lucas was devoted, bringing her water and cool cloths, rubbing her aching back, reading to her in the evenings. And Clara found that despite the discomfort, she was happier than she had ever been. She was creating life, something good and pure, and that felt like the ultimate defiance of everyone who had ever told her she was worthless. Their son was born on a cold March morning in 1880, after a labor that lasted nearly 20 hours. The midwife placed the squalling infant in Clara's arms, and she looked down at his red, furious face and fell in love all over again. Lucas cried when he held his son for the first time, tears streaming down his face as he counted tiny fingers and toes. "He's perfect," Lucas whispered. "He's absolutely perfect." They named him James, after Clara's father who had died when she was young, and from the first day, he was the light of their lives. Lucas was a devoted father, changing diapers and walking the floor with James when he cried, singing off key lullabies that made Clara laugh. She watched her husband with their son and felt her heart swell until she thought it might burst. This was what love looked like. This was what family meant. As James grew from infant to toddler, Clara and Lucas grew too. They learned patience they never knew they had. They learned to function on little sleep and to find joy in small moments. They learned that love was not just a feeling but a choice, made over and over again, in 1,000 tiny ways every day. The ranch continued to thrive. Lucas's reputation as a horse trainer grew, and people came from as far as North Carolina and Maryland to buy his horses or have him work with their difficult animals. Clara managed the business side with skill, negotiating deals and keeping meticulous records. They hired 2 ranch hands to help with the increasing workload, young men who were reliable and hardworking. When James was 2 years old, Clara discovered she was pregnant again. This time, the pregnancy was easier, perhaps because she knew what to expect. Their daughter was born in the autumn of 1882, and they named her Alina after Lucas's mother. She had Lucas's gray-green eyes and Clara's determined chin, and she came into the world already knowing her own mind. Life fell into a rhythm that felt both ordinary and miraculous. Morning chores and evening meals, childhood laughter and midnight feedings, hard work and tender moments. There were challenges, of course. A drought one summer that made money tight. A winter so harsh they nearly lost half their herd. Arguments about money and child rearing, and the 100 small irritations that came with sharing a life. But through it all, Clara and Lucas held fast to each other and to the promises they had made. On their 5th wedding anniversary, Lucas took Clara out to the paddock where he had first taught her about horses. It was a warm November evening, the sky streaked with gold and purple, and their children were with Mrs. Hutchins for the night. "You remember the first time you came here?" Lucas asked, his arm around Clara's waist. Clara leaned into him, breathing in the familiar scent of leather and hay and him. "I was so scared, scared to trust you, scared to hope. And now—" Clara turned to face him, reaching up to touch his face, the beloved lines and angles she knew better than her own. "Now I'm not scared at all. Now I know that loving you was the bravest and best thing I ever did." Lucas kissed her then, slow and deep, and Clara felt the same spark she had felt the first time, the sense of coming home to a place she had never known existed. When they broke apart, Lucas reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, carved wooden box. "I made you something," he said, suddenly looking shy. "It's not much, but I wanted you to have it." Clara opened the box and found a delicate wooden horse, no bigger than her palm, carved with exquisite detail. The mane flowed, the muscles were defined, and tiny stirrups hung from a miniature saddle. It was beautiful, a work of art. "Lucas, this is incredible," Clara breathed. "When did you make this?" "Late at night after you fell asleep. I wanted to give you something that represented us. Horses brought us together, and I thought maybe this could remind you of where we started." He smiled, a little self-conscious. "I told you it wasn't much." Clara closed her hand around the small horse and looked at her husband, this man who had proven every cruel word she had ever been told wrong. "It's everything," she said fiercely. "You're everything. These 5 years with you have been the happiest of my life, and I can't wait for all the years ahead." They made love under the stars that night, in the soft grass of the paddock, holding each other close and whispering promises and plans. And later, walking back to the house hand in hand, Clara thought about the broken girl who had stepped off the stagecoach 7 years ago, terrified and alone. She thought about all the people who had told her she was unlovable, unworthy, unwanted. And she smiled, because they had all been so profoundly wrong. The years that followed were full and rich. James grew into a thoughtful boy who loved books and horses in equal measure. Eleanor was a whirlwind of energy and mischief, keeping her parents on their toes. In 1885, Clara gave birth to twins, 2 more boys they named Samuel and Thomas, and their home became even more chaotic and wonderful. Clara's stepfather died in 1886, drunk and alone in a boarding house in Richmond. When the news reached her, Clara felt nothing but a distant pity. He had been so determined to break her, to prove she was worthless, and he had died never knowing that she had built a beautiful life despite him. Or perhaps because of him, because his cruelty had taught her exactly what she did not want to become. Lucas continued to be everything Clara had never dared to dream of in a husband. He was patient with their children, teaching them gentleness and respect. He supported Clara's business ventures, including a plan to start breeding horses specifically for women riders, a market that was growing as more women demanded independence. He made her laugh, held her when she cried, and loved her with a steadiness that never wavered. On their 10th anniversary, they threw a party that half the county attended. Mrs. Hutchins brought a massive cake. The ranch hands organized games for the children, and neighbors came with food and gifts and good wishes. As Clara looked around at the crowd, at all these people who had become family, she felt overwhelmed with gratitude. That evening, after the guests had left and the children were in bed, Clara and Lucas sat on their porch watching the sunset. Lucas held her hand, his thumb tracing circles on her palm, a gesture that had become so familiar it was like breathing. "Happy?" he asked quietly. Clara thought about the question, about all the years behind them and all the years ahead. She thought about the girl she had been and the woman she had become. She thought about being told she would never be loved, and about the man who had proven that wrong in every possible way. "Happier than I ever thought possible," she said. "Thank you for proving them wrong, Lucas. Thank you for loving me." Lucas pulled her close, pressing a kiss to her temple. "Then watch me love you forever," he said, echoing the words she had spoken to him so many years ago, because forever isn't nearly long enough. They sat together as the sun sank below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson. Two people who had found each other in the darkness and built a life full of light. And if Clara sometimes still heard the echo of her stepfather's cruel words, she had learned to drown them out with the laughter of her children, the success of her business, and the unwavering love of the man beside her. She had been told she would never be loved for who she was, but Lucas had looked at every wild, stubborn, difficult part of her, and had chosen to love her not despite those things, but because of them. He had seen her completely and loved her unconditionally, and in doing so, he had taught her to love herself. The ranch continued to grow over the years, becoming one of the most respected in Virginia. James eventually took over the horse training side of the business, having inherited his father's gift with animals. Alina became a skilled rider and horsewoman, breaking barriers by competing in races usually reserved for men. The twins pursued their own paths, Samuel becoming a veterinarian and Thomas a lawyer, but both remained close to the family ranch. Clara and Lucas grew old together, their hair turning silver, their bodies moving a bit slower, but their love never diminishing. They became grandparents, watching with joy as their children built families of their own. And through it all, they held fast to the promises they had made to each other in the beginning, to love bravely, to choose each other every day, to build something better than what they had been given. On a warm spring evening in 1910, when Clara was 54 and Lucas was 62, they sat together on their porch as they had done thousands of times before. Their hands were clasped, their bodies leaned into each other with the ease of long familiarity, and they watched their grandchildren playing in the yard. "You remember that first day you came to the ranch?" Lucas asked, his voice rougher now with age but still steady. "You brought me bread." Clara smiled, squeezing his hand. "I remember. I was so nervous I could barely breathe. I didn't know how to thank you for saving me." "You didn't need to thank me," Lucas said, "but I'm glad you came. I'm glad you kept coming back." "So am I," Clara said softly. She turned to look at her husband, this man who had been her partner, her lover, her best friend for more than 3 decades. His face was lined now, his body not as strong as it once was, but when he looked at her, she still saw the same love that had been there from the beginning. "I love you, Lucas Fairmont, today and always." "And I love you, Clara Fairmont," Lucas replied, bringing her hand to his lips. "Then, now, and forever." They sat together as the sun set once more, surrounded by the life they had built, the family they had created, the love that had sustained them through every trial and triumph. Clara Ashford had been told she would never be loved for who she was, that she was too much of everything wrong. But Lucas Fairmont had proven that beautiful lie false with every single day of their life together. He had loved her fiercely, completely, eternally. And that love had been enough to heal old wounds, to build new dreams, and to create a legacy that would last long after they were gone. In the end, that was what mattered. Not the cruelty of the past, but the beauty of what they had built together. Not the words that had tried to break her, but the love that had made her whole. Clara had found her forever in the arms of a cowboy who had looked at all her broken pieces and seen only someone worth loving. And every day since had been a gift, a promise kept, a love story written in the quiet moments and grand gestures of a life shared. That was the truth her grandchildren would carry forward, the legacy she and Lucas would leave behind. Love was not about perfection or ease. It was about choosing each other, day after day, year after year, through joy and sorrow, triumph and struggle. It was about seeing someone completely and loving them anyway, or perhaps because of what you saw. It was about two damaged people who had found each other in the darkness and decided to build something beautiful in the light. And as the stars began to emerge in the Virginia sky, Clara closed her eyes and rested her head on Lucas's shoulder, content in the knowledge that she had been wrong all those years ago. She had been worthy of love all along. She had just needed to find the right person to prove it, and he had proven it every single day since. Forever, as it turned out, had been exactly long enough after all, because they had filled every moment of it with love.